Welcome to episode 2 of the LBP XJ Cherokee project. This is the gas tank skid. In episode 1, where the rear bumper was built, a largely unexplained crossmember was tacked in place below it. This crossmember will serve as a starting point for the gas tank skid. The angle iron that was used to locate the crossmember relative to the bumper was cleaned up and gussets added to the ends. This was not only to increase strength, but to also serve as a place to attach trailer safety chains. This was welded and reinstalled so the holes could be located. The crossmember and angle iron brace were removed, and the brackets welded properly to the crossmember. The locations of the holes previously transcribed onto the crossmember were pilot drilled and enlarged to 3/4 of an inch and countersunk. You know what they say about that high sulfur cutting oil? It sure does double as a manly cologne. Of course, both sides of the crossmember were drilled. Then some 3/4 by 0.95 DOM tubing was cut in the bandsaw. This DOM tubing was used as sleeves in the crossmember. I wanted these to fit precisely, and I think I got this one right. Of course, these were welded in case you weren't yet bored of seeing me weld stuff. And then these welds were ground smooth so the brace would seat properly. Everything was bolted back up to check the fit. Looks good so far. At this point, 1 by 125 HSS was cut and notched to make a simple framework to structure the rest of the skid plate around. As it was a source of confusion in episode 1, I will explain that in this case, HSS does not stand for high-speed steel, which is high-carbon steel used in making cutting tools, but rather it stands for hollow structural sections. When I use the term, I am most often referring to box, square, or rectangular tubing, but it is not limited to these shapes. Now that this 1 by 125 HSS was cut to the right length and notched, it was hand bent to the correct angle. These notches were then tacked and fully welded together. Another piece of HSS was tacked into the mix, and the frame was starting to take shape. This was then test fit, and it looks like it will work. So it was tacked into place. Some brackets needed to be made to support the skid plate closer to the front, so 3 by 3 by 3/16 angle was cut and several half-inch holes were drilled in it. The zinc plating was cleaned off some nuts, and they were welded on. Here's the bracket test fit in place. 6 by 3/16 flat bar was then cut to shape to make the sides of the skid plate. Some people have questioned why I use an angle grinder for cutting as much as I do, given I do actually own a plasma cutter. And it is because I prefer the feedback the grinder gives while cutting, and how it naturally wants to cut a straight line. Truthfully, with enough time and patience, just about any shape can be cut with an angle grinder, and there is no need for a more expensive tool to cut many complicated pieces to a reasonable level of precision. The big downside is that it is slower and messier. If you can live with that, an angle grinder will do a lot for you. A single 3/4 inch hole was drilled in both of these pieces, and then dimpled in the press. This wasn't just because I like dimples, but rather because I needed a place to insert a garden hose to clean out the inside of the skid plate. From there, more holes were drilled in even more flat bar to make attachment tabs. And then all these pieces were bolted, clamped, wedged, or somehow else secured in place for the purpose of tacking them. On the other side, things look very much the same, with the exception of there being a cutout for the exhaust. I wasn't really interested in moving the exhaust at this time. A piece of ASTM A53B structural rated pipe was tacked between the two sides at this time. This will serve as a guide along with being additional bracing for the bottom skin. One more piece of flat bar was cut out and cleaned up. This will be the front edge of the skid plate. And risking almost certain third-degree burns if it goes wrong, this too was tacked in place. From there, the skid plate was removed, and some areas were welded fully, since they would be inaccessible once the bottom skin was tacked on. After welding, these areas were ground smooth as to not interfere with the fit of the bottom skins. Look! The angle grinder again! This time cutting a large sheet of 3/16 for the correct size for the bottom skins. Then some strategically placed drain holes were drilled into the skins. On the rear skin, which is on an angle, these were cut into slots as they wouldn't drain otherwise. Then it was just a matter of clamping and tacking the skins in enough places to ensure there would be minimal warpage while welding. The inside was then stitch welded, as that would minimize distortion and be more than strong enough. And then the skid plate was flipped over, and the entirety of the outside seams welded together in segments of approximately 6 inches. Welding in segments minimizes distortion, which is important as I wanted this to still fit after welding, and the breaks in welding allow the welder some rest time, which was also important, since believe me, this was a lot of welding for a poor little Millermatic 180 to do in one shot. Captive nuts needed to be added here, and since the welded-in tubing is slightly oversized for the bolts, some tape was added to them to ensure the nuts were centered. And here they are welded in place. These offensive protrusions of the old hitch brackets were cut off, and the cut edges were flapped smooth. As a last little detail, the forward attachment brackets needed a little work to radius the edges and make them follow the contours of the unibody better. That's a little more professional looking. So that concludes episode 2 of the LBP XJ Cherokee project. I had said in the previous episode that I would paint the rear bumper and gas tank skid in this episode. However, I think I will leave that for the next episode, where I will be building a front bumper, as it is much more convenient for me to paint everything at once. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button or subscribe if you enjoyed this, and feel free to leave any positive or negative comments below.